let's proceed with the class here. Um, I'm going to share the screen so that, which isn't the regular presentation mode, but you can read everything just fine, so it's going to work well. Okay, the photo power class, Rick and I, um, spring of 2021, sitting with people who have cameras like yours does not apply. Okay, our objective is producing great images. The approach is that that you're the artist, and you're a photographic artist. Your medium is photography, and there are two things you need to do fundamentally to produce great images as a photographic artist. One of them is you need to be able to control your medium. You need to be able to make the images have the characteristics that you want and need in order to make this a great image. And the other thing you need to do is to develop the vision, the composition vision, the artistic vision, so that you know what goes into a great image. So you recognize the great image opportunities when they present themselves, and and you can take advantage of them. That's our objective. Okay. And the approach is workshop. It's hands-on. We're going to start with cameras, and today it's going to be explore your camera. We'll do more of that in the next session too. Today's cameras are not trivial, but you need to learn the controls and the displays and things that are called steps and stops, and we'll get there if you don't know what those are now. And with that knowledge of the camera, you then can control your images. And we'll talk about how you use the camera controls to control your images. Then, in the last two sessions, we go into composition. We're going to analyze a collection of the world's greatest images and um, and see what makes them great images, uh, what to look for to create a great image, what goes into a great image. I think you'll find that enjoyable. It's nice just to look at the world's greatest images, and it's quite valuable. Okay, moving on. Uh, that's a good image right there. That was in Alaska, um, Fish Creek outside Hyder, Alaska. And you needed a really long telephoto under the circumstances to do it. Okay, um, explore your camera. You have a number of automatic exposure modes. There's not just one, and they're very useful. They're particularly useful if time is limited. There's always a trade-off between uh, optimizing things and the time it takes. Sometimes there is no time. The subject is going to be gone. The people are impatient. The wildlife is going to move in 2 seconds. Um, those are times when you absolutely want to use automatic exposure modes. Um, you also, though, do need to watch what the automatic exposure mode is doing. And if it's going to trace your pictures uh, and you've got time, then you certainly need to take control and make things good. Um, so today, what we're going to do is eliminate the mystery from exposure control. We are going to manually control exposure without flash. That means aperture, shutter, and ISO. And we'll not worry about focus. We're going to use your standard autofocus modes. Aperture is how large the opening in the lens that the light comes in through is. And you can vary that. That's the f-stop or the f number. Um, and bigger opening lets in more light. Um, and if there's more light, you can use a faster shutter speed, for example. The shutter speed or the shutter time is simply the time the shutter's open. It's normally closed, briefly opens, closes again. That's the shutter. ISO is the sensitivity of the image sensor. With modern digital cameras, we can, with a little dial or switch or in a menu, you can select the sensitivity of the image sensor, the amount of light that it needs to get a picture. And those three together are the things you control for exposure. If you're using an automatic exposure mode, it controls some or all of those things, depending on the mode. We'll, we're going to get there. Okay, here are the exposure modes on essentially every camera. Manual. In that case, you get to control the aperture and the shutter speed for sure, and perhaps the ISO. Um, and that's it. You control everything. The picture may be overexposed, underexposed, perfect, but you're in control and you can do whatever you want. Then there's S, which stands for shutter, or TV, which stands for time value, or T, depending on the manufacturer of your camera. They use all those codes, but all of those are what we call shutter priority. What that means is you get to pick the amount of time the shutter's open, and the camera's going to do everything else to get what it thinks is the right exposure with its built-in meter. It's an automatic mode, but it's an automatic mode that lets you control the shutter, and then the camera does everything else. Similar to that is A or AV, aperture or aperture value, depending on who made your camera. And in that case, you set the aperture. You get to control the aperture, but the shutter time and the perhaps or perhaps not, the ISO is automatic. Another mode that your camera will have is program mode, and everyone calls that P. And what that means is the camera controls both the shutter and the aperture. It may also control the ISO, but for sure it controls shutter and aperture. And so if more light is needed, it may keep the shutter open longer and increase the aperture, for instance. Less light, it may decrease the aperture and speed up the shutter. Then there's auto ISO, and that's camera automatically controlling the ISO or the image sensor sensitivity. And that can work with any of the modes that I've mentioned above. You can also have manual ISO with any of the modes that I mentioned above. Auto ISO is useful. For our projects, I want you to be able to make changes and see the effect very clearly. And if you have auto ISO on, it will change the ISO to eliminate the effect of any change you make. So for purposes of our projects, I'd like for you to turn off the auto ISO, and we'll deal with how to do that when the time comes. There's generally unless you have a real pro level camera, you'll also have something that's like an A on a green background, usually automatic mode. And in that case, the camera does everything. You can't make any inputs. You can't control anything. Um, and for our purposes, we want to avoid that mode. We don't want to use it. We would like to be able to have control, to see what's happening, and take action if it's necessary to change it. So I'm going to ask you to avoid the full automatic mode. Any questions on these modes? There probably are some.
I have a quick question, Bob.
Yes.
So if I put my camera into program mode, my camera does not have automatic mode. So if I put it in program mode and put ISO into auto, that is effectively the equivalent of the A mode. Is that true?
No, it really isn't. The A on the green box mode will also bring the flash in when it wants you to have flash.
Okay, and given that my camera doesn't have flash on it.
Oh, in that case, yes.
Okay, then I have another question.
Bob, I think there is another illustration of the difference between the auto mode and P mode that probably would apply to John. In the full auto mode, the camera is going to go to auto white balance, whereas in the P mode, you could choose a fluorescent white balance if you're shooting under fluorescent lights or whatever.
Yeah, good point, Rick. That's absolutely right. Yeah.
Okay, then something else you said confused me a little bit. Let's say I have it set on aperture priority and I put ISO into auto. The camera's only going to make a choice about two things, the shutter speed and the ISO. I still get to control aperture. Is that true?
That's true.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Aperture priority lets you control aperture, and the shutter speed is automatic. And if you're using auto ISO, the ISO will also be automatic. That's right. And shutter priority is exactly the same thing, except it's the shutter that you control. Okay, any other questions?
Well, I guess I have a question because I have the smartphone, but Rick had said I could download an app, right? Was it ProCamera or something? And
Yeah.
I wonder if I did that, would it give me these choices, or what choices would it give you?
Well,
Depends on the app.
yeah.
No, he recommended one, a specific
yeah.
one when I came to the end of December class of year.
Yeah, ProCamera will give you the ability to, for example, specify a particular ISO and or a particular shutter speed. But if your phone does not have a variable aperture lens, then clearly no software is going to allow you to set an aperture. And my phone does not appear to have an iris diaphragm in the lens. It seems to shoot wide open, period, because it has no diaphragm to close down.
I think most of them are that way, and maybe all. I have a new phone and I haven't fully explored its camera yet, and it might have an aperture control, but I don't know.
Then if you move up to a camera like, like your, what is it called? Like, it's not the ProCamera that's a point and shoot, but more like what your wife had, Rick.
Yeah.
Does that give you these
yes.
options?
Yeah, my wife's camera has all of the flexibility of operating modes that a professional camera does. And ProCamera would do that for phone, except for the fact that if you don't have the hardware to vary a lens opening, then you can't vary the lens opening. That's just not going to happen. based on software. You can pretend to get the effect of closing down the lens on a smartphone by shooting in what's called portrait mode. And after the picture is taken, the camera tries to figure out what's the subject and what's the background, and it uses software to try to blur the background if you told it you wanted the effect of a shallow depth of field. But that's an imitation rather than a real change of aperture and depth of field.
Yeah. And it's really better to do things like that in post-processing on your computer, so that you can see what you've got beforehand and then do that processing. And if you like the result, fine. But if you don't, change the processing and, you know, change and adjust and so on. And it's easier to do that with your computer and a nice big display and a real keyboard and everything
Thank you.
than with a phone. Though there is some of that capability in some phones now. I have that in my new phone.
Thank you.
Okay. This is very important. This is really basic. Are there any other questions on this, or is everyone comfortable with it? Okay, we will go on. We measure exposure in what's called stops. And a stop is really simple. It's just a factor of 2. One stop less exposure is half the exposure, and one stop more is twice the exposure. 3 stops more is 8 times the exposure, because that's 2 times 2 times 2, 3 stops. And 2 times 2 times 2 is 8. Okay? This works at low light. It works with full sunlight. It works everywhere. Any questions on stops? Okay, good. A stop, however, is too big a step to have as the smallest increment. We need to be able to control things in smaller steps than a full stop. And it turns out that 1/3 of a stop is just about right. And every camera defaults to that. In many cases, you can change that, but you shouldn't, because it really is just about the right answer. So what that means is that one camera step is 1/3 of a stop. And that turns out to be a factor of about 1.25. And if you multiply 1.25 times 1.25 times 1.25, that will turn out to be just about 2. So 3 steps is indeed 1 stop. Okay, so what are we going to do with all of this? The answer is, as we make changes, we're just going to count the steps. We're not going to worry about the stops. All the stops are convenient to think in terms of. But if we want a 2-stop change in exposure, we're going to count 6 steps in the direction, either more light or less light, that we want to go in. Okay, any questions? Again, this is basic. We're going to be using it every day. All right, very good. Shutter speed now controls any blur that results from the subject moving. And what you want to do, if you can, generally, is follow the movement with your camera if you're dealing with a moving subject, someone that's running, an automobile passing, an airplane flying by. We call that pan with the action. The panning is just to move your camera, to point it in different directions. And generally, when you're dealing with an action subject, you will pan with the action. And that helps. It means that the shutter speed doesn't have to stop the movement of the object. It only has to stop the error that you make in following the object. If you could follow the object, your subject, if you could follow your subject perfectly, you could use just phenomenally low shutter speeds for a fast moving object. And now, for human movement or other large animals, as fast as people can move, that's sports, children playing very actively, the shutter speed you need has to be 1/400th of a second. Faster is okay, but it doesn't really gain you anything much. You're wasting light. Slower, not fatal, but you'll lose shots. So most sports photography is done at 1/400th of a second. And you need to remember that. There aren't very many things like this that I will tell you need to remember. This is one. 1/400th of a second for sports action. If you're asleep on the sofa and someone comes up and shakes you and wakes you up and says sports action shutter speed before your eyes are open, you need to be able to say 1/400th of a second before opening your eyes. This needs to be automatic. And for slow human or large animal movement, 1/100th of a second is generally good enough. And that's a good thing to remember too. Now, these shutter speeds don't freeze motion necessarily. They may, but they may not. But if someone's running, for example, at a 400th of a second, there'll be some blur in their legs probably. But if they're running and you're panning with them, the 400th of a second will work fine. And some blur may really help the image. Rick used to do some professional photography where he made use of this quite effectively, and he can tell you about it now.
Yep. I fell into taking pictures of amateur auto racers and trying to sell the pictures to them. And I found very quickly that if I used a fast shutter speed, I could get a very high percentage of sharp pictures. But if I used a fast shutter speed, the car looked like it was parked on the track and nobody wanted to buy the picture. If you want to give people the bragging rights of showing their friends that they were on the racetrack and going fast, you have to use a slow enough shutter speed that the wheels of the car are a blur to imply that speed. And once you start using a slow shutter speed with a fast moving car, now your skill at panning with the car accurately determines how sharp the portions of the car that you don't want blurry are. So that becomes a skill to practice.
And that gives you a wonderfully blurred background too.
Absolutely.
Which makes it look like the car is fairly flying, even if it actually wasn't going fast at all.
Very true.
And as Rick said, that sells pictures, and that makes for good pictures, which is why they sell. But okay, these are just a couple of examples of shutter speeds, but they're very important examples, because sports action, children playing, is something that we'll frequently have to deal with. Grandchildren are our favorite photo subject after all. And active play is a very good activity to make great photos of the grandchildren. So this is something you need. Okay, any more questions here before we leave this one?
Well, I have a question. I'm just curious. Is this also related to ISO? Because I remember years ago when we had film, it just used those same numbers that you're using here, the 100 and 400. I don't know if that's a coincidence or if they're related.
It is not a coincidence. When we converted from digital, when digital photography systems were developed, they made use of everything they could from the film world. And so an ISO on a digital camera of 100 is just as sensitive as ISO 100 film. It is the same thing by design.
But it's not the same thing as the 1/100th of a second shutter speed.
Right. The shutter
So
speed and the ISO have no connection.
Yeah.
They both work to determine the effective exposure, and we're going to get to that in just a bit. But they're independent factors. The shutter speed, the aperture, and the ISO are completely independent things. Each of those can be set independently of the others, but each one of them has an effect on the exposure, a profound effect on the exposure.
Thank you.
Uh-huh. Okay, here we are, shutter speeds. This is the list of, now let's see, this column goes down to the bottom and then continues over here. The only reason I didn't put these in a single column is that the numbers would be too small to read conveniently. But it's really just one column of numbers. And this is the shutter speeds that your camera has. Your camera may or may not go down this slow. It may not go this fast. It might go faster, but this is the progression of shutter speeds. This quote mark is a secret code that some cameras, but not all, use. It means seconds. So in other words, 10 quote mark is 10 seconds. This 10 without a quote mark is 1/10 of a second. This 200 is 1/200th of a second. This 1 is 1 second. That's how you read the numbers. And these numbers are 1/3 stop steps apart. These are the steps in shutter speed. And your camera has these very numbers. Any questions on these? Okay, fine, good. We're going to do a project. We said hands-on workshop. Here we go. I would like for you to use your shutter priority auto exposure mode. That's ST or TV. I don't know of anything else that's used for that, but I wouldn't guarantee it doesn't exist. And use for the moment your widest angle zoom, no flash, your highest ISO, and to get your highest ISO, auto ISO really wouldn't hurt either in this case. And take pictures. Do you have, if you've got another person available who can help, maybe they would be a subject for you and move fast or slow. You don't need a person to move none. The picture on the wall or furniture on the other side of the room won't move. If you don't have a person to help you there conveniently, you can use you can move the camera about how you would expect a person moving fast to move, or a person who's moving like I'm moving here, which isn't very much to move.
if you want a moving subject, if you look out the window at the moment, at least here in Yorba Linda, it's windy enough that you get plenty of motion from the plants.
Oh, really? I hadn't looked, but okay. Do we have that much wind? Gosh, I don't. I've got 1 mile per hour right now.
Huh. Okay. Must be a local weather condition for me.
Yeah. Well, and who knows what everyone else has. But if you've got wildly moving plants and leaves outside, that's a perfectly good motion subject. But in any event, what I'd like for you to do is take pictures at those 3 shutter speeds, a 400th of a second, a 100th of a second, and a 25th of a second, with different kinds of motion, no motion and slow motion and very fast motion, and then magnify your images and see what you got. Look and see what the effect of those different shutter speeds were. Go for it then. And if you have any questions about how to control your camera, we'll do our best to deal with that.
Yeah, Susan, if you're going to be using the phone, I can help you to try downloading Pro Camera at this stage if that's what you want to do.
Okay, thank you.
Well,
Is he wanting to do these pictures like right now
yes.
or between? Oh,
This is a
I
workshop.
don't have anybody to
This
gonna run around. My dog is sleepy.
You know, if necessary, you can move the camera to simulate subject motion.
Yeah, some intentional camera shake is a perfectly good alternative to a moving subject for this exercise.
That's the best thing you have available, it sounds like. So you can go for it.
Okay.
Okay. Jerry, what kind of camera do you have?
I have a Nikon D3500.
A Nikon D3500?
Yes.
Great. Okay. I use Nikon cameras also, so I'm familiar with the typical controls for Nikon. So I can help you with the controls to the extent that may be needed.
Okay, thank you.
All right, this is where we were. And where we're going next is the whole picture of steps. The shutter, the two shutter columns at the right are exactly what we had before, no change. But we've added a column for the apertures. These are the apertures in your camera. Yours doesn't probably go down to 1.4, it'll cut off somewhere, probably somewhere in this range here. It probably does go all the way to f/22. And ISOs may well cut off at 100 and not have these. They may go up this far, they may not go this far, they may go further. All that's fine. But these are your ISOs and your apertures and your shutter speeds. And the set of blue numbers and the set of red numbers give you the same effective exposure. Those are equivalent.
I don't know exactly what you mean, Bob.
Okay, so the red numbers, 100th second shutter speed, f/16, ISO 100. That's an exposure, and there is a scene brightness that would be correct for. If we have that scene, if this is the correct exposure for our case, then the blue numbers are also the correct exposure. How do I know that? The picture gets darker as you go down in all these lists. We are going to go from the red numbers to the blue numbers. In shutter speed, we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 steps. Okay? So the picture got 6 steps darker, which is 2 stops darker. That's quite a lot. That's pretty dark. But we can compensate for that. In this case, the compensation from the red to the blue is 4 stops. 1, 2, 3, 4 stops.
You're saying stops and you mean steps.
I did mean steps. I did not mean stops. You're right. Thanks, Rick. 4 steps brighter in aperture and 2 more steps, 5 and 6, and we took those in ISO. We could have taken
Oh.
all 6 in ISO. We could have taken all 6 in aperture. It doesn't matter. We
Oh.
split them up any way we want. But as long as the number of steps up and down on this chart are the same, the picture will have the same exposure. That is really basic. And you'll make use of that again and again. So let's
Thank you.
see. I know that Jerry knows how to control the ISO on his camera. Do you know how to control your ISO, Susan?
Yes, I do.
You do. Good. Okay. That leaves aperture. Do you both know how to control aperture?
Well, I guess it's not an option for me.
Oh, it probably isn't for you. Okay. Well, we don't need breakout rooms in that case then. Okay, Jerry, to control aperture on your camera,
Uh-huh.
it's a little bit complicated. If you're in the aperture priority mode, which is the A mode,
Yeah.
then it's that same thumb wheel.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
If you're in the shutter priority mode or the manual mode, you cannot control aperture. What you have to do to control aperture in those modes is go to the aperture priority mode, set the aperture you want, and then go to the mode that you want, either manual or shutter.
Oh, it will remember that.
Yeah, you've got to remember that.
Okay.
That's the way your camera works.
I see.
So Jerry's camera is a 1 control dial camera rather than a 2
It's
control
a
dial?
one wheel camera, yes. Some cameras have 2 wheels, and that's handy because you can control aperture with one and shutter with the other. But yours is a 1 wheel camera.
Okay.
And you just you can control everything. You just have to know how to do it.
Okay.
Okay, this is, we're out of time here. So, so let's end, but the first thing we're going to do is really sort of a review of this steps thing, and we'll do a steps project where you determine the exposure by experiment, just by seeing if it's too light or too dark or just right. And then you'll go to, and then change something and count the steps to change other things to compensate. And you'll see that you can play all these parameters up and down very nicely. Okay, I will see you in 2 weeks.
Okay,
All right. Thank you.
thanks
Thank
all.
you.